We left off last time by looking at essential vocabulary and also carbon. Carbon's hugely important, we know, because of its specific chemical properties and the fact that it makes up the backbone for a lot of our organic molecules. What we're going to do now is we're going to kind of dive into the first of our four specific categories of organic macromolecules. The significance of these is that we kind of started the year with what makes living things different. So, how do we get the diversity of life? And evolution helps us to explain that, to explain how organisms became different in the ways that they did. What we kind of do now is we take a step back from that and we look at the unity of life. And we can actually start at the molecular level to understand how all organisms are similar. All organisms are made up of four categories of organic molecules. So carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids. By understanding the chemistry, the structure, and the function of these, we can learn a lot about how life is similar to itself. So we can kind of support that conclusion that all life came from similar origins. And we're going to also relate how structure and function are related to each other in nature, which is another huge enduring sort of concept we see come up again and again and again. We begin by kind of looking at the word itself here. So carbohydrate, what that actually means is carbo relates to carbon and hydrate relates to water. So based on that, what elements do you think you're going to find in carbohydrates? Good, so hopefully you were able to kind of figure out that it's going to be carbon for carbo and hydrate, so H2O. So we're going to get hydrogen and oxygen. The hydrate is actually really helpful to remember too, because what we find is that carbohydrates always come in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, meaning that for every one carbon atom and one oxygen atom, you get twice as many hydrogen atoms. So if you can literally remember carbohydrate is carbon H2O, it'll not only help you to remember the elements that are in there, but also help to remember the ratio they're in. This becomes very helpful when you're asked to differentiate between lipids and carbohydrates, which have the same elements, but lipids do not have the ratio. So the example I gave to you guys on the bottom is glucose. Glucose is a carbohydrate because we notice it's in its formula, C6H12O6. We have 6 carbohydrates, 6 oxygens, so same number of those atoms, and twice as many hydrogens. We have 12 of them. So quick concept check. So number 1, is it a carbohydrate? C8H24O8. Hopefully you're able to get that it's not. So it passes our first check. We have a 1 to 1 ratio of carbon and oxygen. There's both 8 atoms of each, but it does not pass our second check. So we should have carbon in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So instead of having 24, so that's a 1 to 3 to 1 ratio, we should have 16. So if it was C8H16O8, you would be good to go to call that a carbohydrate. Number 2, if a carbohydrate has 3 atoms, how many hydrogens and oxygens should it have? Good. Hopefully we're able to remember our 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So we want to have twice as many hydrogens. So we should have 6 hydrogens. And we want to have the same number of oxygens. So we should have 3 oxygens. So what we're going to do now is learn the specific categories, or the specific terms rather, for our different levels of complexity within our carbohydrates. So commonality to all of our macromolecules is that they all are made up of monomers, which are those small units that repeat to create a large molecules called our polymers. Now within each of our categories, we have specific names for the monomers and specific names for the polymers. Remember, monomer and polymer are just general terms. So when we want to talk about the monomer of your carbohydrates, we call those monosaccharides. Now mono means one, so it's helpful to remember that it is the building block because it's one unit of a carbohydrate. Saccharide means sugar. So saccharin actually comes from the Latin meaning sweet. So a monosaccharide is one sugar, which is why sometimes we hear these referred to in sort of more common senses as simple sugars. The 3 that I want you to know from monosaccharides, the first is sort of an all-star molecule for this whole year, and that's glucose. Glucose is stored by our autotrophs during the process of photosynthesis. And then during cellular respiration, all organisms are going to break down the glucose molecule at their mitochondria to make energy, to make ATP. So glucose is just hugely important to life and something that we are going to talk about all year. The next one you may have heard of. If you've heard of it, it's more than likely you've heard of it in a rather negative context, and that's fructose. So fructose is the monosaccharide that we find in our fruits and in our vegetables. Now, if you've heard of it, you've more than likely heard of it as high fructose corn syrup, What high fructose corn syrup is it's a concentrated form of this sugar that is sort of purified down from corn, hence the corn syrup. And it is used for sweetening a lot of snacks and sweets and things that people perceive as not being very healthy for you. So it gets sort of a bad rap. But realize that fructose itself is perfectly natural. It's the same stuff that when you eat a banana or grapes or any of your fruits and vegetables that's in it. It's just people take issue with high fructose corn syrup with the concentration of this monosaccharide. The last one you more than likely have not heard of. This is galactose. So still a monosaccharide, and you can see the structure of galactose off to the right-hand side. We find this in a lot of our dairy, so in eggs, in cheeses, in things like that. Now we're going to get a little more complex. So monosaccharides are your smallest level. Now we're going to get a little more complex and talk about disaccharides. So my question for you is, how many monosaccharides are there in a disaccharide? So hopefully we're able to break our word parts down. So mono means one, di means two. So here we're getting just slightly more complex. Two monosaccharides are going to join together to form a disaccharide. So there's three of these that we should know. The first one is maltose. Maltose is the type of sugar that is found in your breads. It's also found in things like yams. We find it in malted milk balls, so things like Whoppers and malted milkshakes. That's the sugar in them. Maltose is also in malted beverages. It's the sugar that yeast are going to break down in the fermentation process to produce alcohol. So that's also where maltose is commonly used and referred to in our diets. So there's a picture of maltose over to the right-hand side. We'll notice that each of our monosaccharides is going to have a very characteristic ring shape, and we're going to practice building these. So when we look over at the structure of maltose, we notice that there's one ring to represent one monosaccharide attached to another ring to represent the other monosaccharide. The fact that they're joined together right there makes it a disaccharide. Sucrose, you all have sucrose at home. I know it. So sucrose is just sugar that you would use to make cakes and cookies and brownies and ice cream. And it is the combination of one glucose monosaccharide and one fructose monosaccharide. The last one, and this one we have more than likely heard of, I think. So this is your last disaccharide. It is lactose. Lactose is a combination of one galactose monosaccharide and one fructose monosaccharide. And this is the more common or the most common sugar found in your dairies. So in all of your cheeses, in your butters, your milks, your things like that. Now, the reason we more than likely have heard of lactose is because we know that something exists called lactose intolerance. What lactose intolerance is, some people's digestive systems are ill-equipped to be able to break down the lactose sugar during the digestive process. So what happens is this sugar can sit in the gut and it can start to produce, it can ferment. So it can create gases and be very uncomfortable for the person. So there are some sort of some drugs and pills people can take to help to deal with this. But that's what lactose intolerance is. It's people's sort of digestive systems can't break down this sugar. So really quick concept check here. I told you we were going to talk about carbohydrates, yet the only thing I've talked about are sugars. So we know from looking at I know you guys do the plate now, but we'll use my pyramid now. So we know from learning about the food pyramid that in our diets, we talk about sweets and we talk about carbohydrates being two different things. But based on what we've seen so far, can we explain the relationship between the two of these? The answer is yes, we can. So it's a matter of a difference in levels of complexity. The monomers of carbohydrates, so your monosaccharides and your disaccharides, are dietary sugars, which is why we call them simple sugars. So things like sucrose that you cook with or fructose that you find in your fruit, when we eat those, they taste sweet and they're very small carbohydrate molecules. The polymers of carbohydrates, those are the ones that we're used to referring to as our dietary carbohydrates. So the polymers are things that we would find in our breads, our pastas. We catch this up in our sort of regular everyday speech and the fact that we sometimes refer to sugars as simple sugars. And that's kind of describing their structural complexity, whereas we refer to our carbohydrates in our diet as complex carbs. So sugars and carbs on a molecular perspective are the exact same molecule, just different levels of complexity.